Hi, my name is Daniel Pop. I'm also working at BTech Plus in Cluj, in Romania. What we're going to do is we're going to take an actual real-world use case, which involves implementing a headless application. We're going to start by having a front-end website ready, already developed in React. And we're going to have to design the REST resources for the backend part. Okay, even if this is a workshop and this was supposed to be that we're working together, yeah? Do I have to talk louder or not that loud? Ah, okay. Whoa. Cool. So, as I said, even if this was supposed to be a workshop, which means that we are all going to write code, I have all the setup ready to be tested at that address. So if you want to follow along, that's fine. If not, I'm going to show you the code examples anyway, so it's fine both ways. Okay, so this is the use case. The client comes and says, well, I have a website that has some cooking recipes. And he wants to switch it to a front-end framework. So therefore, he needs a backend application as a provider for the REST endpoints. Usually when this happens, there are two ways of doing it. You either, as a backend developer, you establish what were going to be the endpoints, and you force the one that's going to develop the front-end application follow your mockups, your structure. Or you could do it the other way around. The front-end guy, which will probably going to develop the front-end application before you're going to develop the REST endpoints, will establish what were going to be the structure that's going to be used for the endpoints. In the real world, usually it's the second scenario that happens, so that's a small problem for us. Because in theory, everything sounds great. You got a REST API for your models, and you can use those to fetch data. But when it comes to actually implementing an application, the front-end guy comes and says, well, I would need a different structure for that. Because I can map the default JSON output that a node gets me on my Angular models, let's say. So there's a problem. Most of the projects, even if we like to call that they use a REST API, they don't actually use a REST API. They just use some endpoints that return some JSON. Because in order to have it to call it a REST API, you would have to have a setup structure that and a couple of endpoints that would allow you to update models, to get all of them, and to delete them. So let's present you the front-end website that it's already developed and shipped to by the front-end guy. Let's see if I can do it like this. We're gonna keep switching between the actual website and the presentations. So nonetheless, the presentation doesn't have much information, only guides. So it could help me to follow along. Okay, so we got a very simple website here. By the way, it's in React. If any of you are actual React developers, I'm only a beginner, so if you're gonna take a look at the code later, don't be too harsh on the comments. So, what we got here? Well, the website has 3 pages. We got a home page that shows up the latest recipe that was added on the website. We got an endpoint that lists all the recipes. And we got another page that allows us to create a recipe. So how should we design this? Well, we take a look at all recipes, because that's the first one that usually pops up. And we think, that's simple. All we gotta do is make a view, have it export the rest, and that's it. Well, it's not that easy. Because fine, you might create an endpoint that lists all the recipes, but the question that comes up when we're designing our headless application is, what about the rest of the info? What about this title? What about the text and what about the picture? Because usually the client wants everything on the web page to be administrable. And that's a problem when we're designing our API. Because what that means is that we're going to have to make a model for that as well. And we're going to have to also create ways of adding, updating, listing, deleting all that info, even if we only use it once in our website. So that's why I don't actually like to call it developing a REST API, but more like developing some endpoints for a front application. Okay, so from what we can see here, we're going to use 3, and because there's going to be a single page for a recipe, we will have 4 endpoints. One endpoint will allow us to list the latest recipe. One endpoint will allow us to list all the recipes. One will show us the details for a single recipe, and another one would be used to create a recipe. Okay, so the presentation is made, its target audience are people that are not that used to Drupal and REST resources in general. So I might go a bit slow in the start, but at the end you'll get used to the structure and I won't stay and describe every line of code. But only gonna do it for the first endpoint. So let me switch it up a bit. Okay. I think we should keep it like this. Or not. Okay, so pre-requirements. As I said, you need a Drupal installation, and you need a couple of modules that would help you to achieve creating the endpoints. As my colleague earlier said, you need something that would allow you to bypass the CORS restriction that the browser inputs. And you would also need a way to export your REST configuration. And because Drupal doesn't have it by default, we're going to use some contribute modules. So I'm going to present you the back office interface for these 2 modules. The first one, as I said, is the CORS module. You can either configure it by going to the default services YAML file, as my colleague earlier said, or you could do it by going to configuration. And once it loads up, you'll see. And you'll have a separate page for it to configure it. I would recommend not using this page because it does some weird stuff with parsing what the rules you're going to enter there. So it's a bit unreliable. Depends on how many endpoints you will have. Let's see what the problem is. Murphy's Law, back at it again. If something goes wrong. Okay, so you will need to install the CORS module in order to have this thingy. What it does is allow you to set up your CORS from here and not by going to in a configuration file. As you can see, you would have to input the info in a certain order and with a certain structure. You would define all the paths that are allowed to be requested by external URLs. You would also define those URLs there, and then the headers that are allowed to be used within those requests. That's the CORS setup, and you would also need to, as I said, to export the configuration of your REST endpoints. For that, you will use the REST UI module. What it does is it lists you all the REST endpoints that exist on your Drupal installation, and it allows you to finally filter them and export them in the actual Drupal configuration. Okay, so these were the prerequisites. Just a second. Let's move on to creating an actual endpoint. So, as I said, I prepared the code for it, for all the steps. So, we only have to move on the branch configured specially for that. Yep, step 1. And we should import the configuration. Whoops. Okay. I'm explaining this in more depth because I noticed that there were some people in the room that are not Drupal developers, so it might help them create their own headless website. Okay, so what do we need in order to create an endpoint, a Drupal endpoint? Well, let's take a look at the code. If we take a look at the configuration that was imported, you see that there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 config files. The last one is used for course settings. There are two configuration files used for permissions for users. We'll see in a bit what that means. The core extension configuration is used for enabling Drupal modules. And then there's this configuration for our endpoint, the endpoint that gets us the latest recipe. Okay, so let's take a look at the code. Do you guys, I think I should make it a bit zoomed in. I think it's fine. So, in order to have a REST endpoint, you would have to create a plugin. So, you come in, you create your own module, and then you add a plugin. The plugin has to follow a certain namespace, as you can see in these folders, which is standard, so you have to know how to do it. Okay, so a plugin is basically a Drupal class of a certain type that has a special annotation. Plugins have an annotation of type REST resource. So that always have to be present there. Within that, you would have to define an ID for your REST endpoint. In our case, we called it latest recipe REST resource, a label, and a URI path with a certain structure. What that means is that we say, this is our endpoint, we called it this way, and it can be accessed at this path. There is a small difference between endpoints that are meant for GET requests and endpoints that are meant for POST requests in this path definition, but you will see this later. So, as I said, you create your class, your plugin, and in this plugin you would have to define 1 or 2 methods. One for GET, if you want to use it for GET request, or a POST function for a POST request. So what we do here is just fetch our latest node of type recipe and create it using a certain structure. Well, you might ask, what's the structure that needs to be outputted? Well, thanks to our front-end developer, we know that. Usually when you design web applications, if the front-end developer creates the application forward and then sends you the code, you would have some sort of configuration file. I called it config.js. What this means is that you will have a file that will tell you, okay, these are all the endpoints that I need. This is the list. I need you to go through each of them and make sure that your endpoint returns this structure for my calls. So we take a look. We see that the homepage configuration is in the homepage.json mockup. We open the file and we see that the guy needs an object, a JSON object that has the title, an image, and text. Fine. So we do this for him. We go in our plugin and we make sure that our response is built using this structure. It would have a title, it would have an image field, an image path, and it would have the body for the text that the recipe node has. Okay, that's all we gotta do to create the actual resource. But you would also have to configure it from the back office. So what do we need to do? Well, we first come into this interface, the interface for configuring the REST resources. And we should be able to see, once we created our resource, we should be able to see our resource here. As you can see, it was already enabled because we imported the settings. But you would have to find it, enable it, and within the enable form, you get to pick a couple of parameters. First of all, you would have to choose the granularity. That means that do you want to grant permission based on every method, or you would like to grant permissions based on the whole endpoint? You can also select the methods that you would allow, you would grant permissions for, and the type of the output. Once on top of that, you would also have to select an authentication provider, but since we don't use any special authentication, the cookie one is present. Okay, so this was the second step that is needed when you create an endpoint. The third one would be the course configuration. Okay, so you would come here, type in the configuration for the course following the structure that is described there. What we say here is that we created a rule for the rest/latest recipe path, the one that we defined in the plugin definition, and we allow requests to this endpoint from the origin of our front website. Once you do this, there's only a final step that needs to be done when, in order to have a working endpoint, you'd have to grant permissions for that endpoint. How you do that? Well, using the Drupal default permission system, you'd have to go to the page that allows you to change permissions. In this huge list that's going to show up, you would have to find your endpoint. Under the category RESTful Web Services, you see access get on latest recipe resource. Usually you allow, if there's no some sensitive data involved, you allow both anonymous and authenticated user to fetch that data. And that's pretty much it. You save the form. Once you do that, you will be able to go into your front-end application and replace the path to the mockup file with your actual endpoint. So we're going to have to paste here the path to our backend endpoint. Cool. We also noticed that our front-end guy that developed the application also requires the base URL of the website, of the backend website. So we might as well fill that up. Okay. Cool. So once we did that, we will be able to finally link the application with our backend. As you can see, I generated some dummy content in order to have something to test with. So we should be able to see this title if we refresh the front-end page. Okay. Might take a bit. And if not, comes the fun part, the debugging. Okay, so what do you do when this happens? Well, you open the console and you check. What are the requests that are being made? Well, we see that there's a request for the latest recipe, but the response is an empty array. Why is that? Well, we can notice that the status code is 406. That means not acceptable. Drupal needs, for its endpoints, for you to specify the format of the request in the URL. So you would have to go back to your configuration and append to the URL !_format. And then you would define the format that you use to return the information. In our case, it's going to be JSON. So we do that. We refresh the page. Oh, forgot the question mark. There you go. Oh, nothing. Well, fuck. The latest recipe was supposed to be added here, but let's not debug it right now. Basically, that's all you gotta do. If you take a look at the request that's being made, you can notice that this is the actual content of the latest recipe that we want to retrieve, and we can call it today. We did what we were supposed to do. Let's do the same thing for the other page. So, in order to do that, we're gonna switch to the next branch and do the same thing for our all recipes page, the listing page. So we're gonna have to switch to our second branch and again import the configuration. What happened here is I think that the browser cached the request. So yeah, there it is. Okay, so given the fact that what we got here is a list, I think the intuitive way would be to create a view page that it returns all the information that we need. So we're gonna have to go and see what views module offers for a REST endpoint. Okay, so what views does is it allows us to create a page that lists data using a REST export. What that means is that instead of having actual markup returned by the view, you would have JSON. You could also select whole JSON as a format, but in our case, JSON would suffice. Again, the first thing what you would want to do if you were to design the application would be to go to your mockups, check what structure is needed for the listing page, and then make sure that the views outputs the same things that you have here. As I said, when designing headless applications, the problem is how much of the information in the front end you want to be administrable, and how that affects the REST resources. Well, based on that, you would have a different structure for your calls. And usually, if the website is small and it has only a couple of endpoints, your front-end guy won't separate the calls based on the model or on the type of the resource that's returned. He would just put all of them in a single JSON object, have different keys, and that's it. That's why it's really important to communicate before the implementation starts. So you tell him the needs for your data models, so he knows how to structure its goals. In this case, you would logically you would have to make two calls: one for the information that's on top for the first box, and the second one for the second box for the list of recipes. Okay, so I'm not going to go all over again the configuration for it because it's pretty simple. Just a few words about what fields we return in our view. You would have to return the title of the content, the path to the image, as we see it's needed in the mockup, and you would also have to return a path that would specify the endpoint for the information about a single recipe. This is because when we click on an endpoint here, you would see that it will take us to a page where you would want to see the whole info of a recipe. So in order to do that, we would also have to create another endpoint that is made in the same way as the first one, but we don't return the latest recipe. We return the recipe passed by an URL parameter. The structure is the same as for the first one, but the difference comes when we define the path. We would have an ID between brackets. That means that that's a parameter that is going to be passed dynamically, and what that changes to our definition is that it adds another parameter within our get method. That's all. That's all the difference between those two requests. So we're going to do the same thing for as we did for the first resource. We check the view page to see what's the path used for this REST export. We copy that and we modify the configuration of our front-end application. Once that's done, we can go back to our front-end application and test again. Cool. So we got new data coming from our backend. And if we click one of the links, we can see what request is being made for the backend, and we can debug it in this case and see what goes wrong when the request is made. Okay. The message says that there's no route found for this URL, so I'll have to debug it, but not now. Okay, so once we did this page, what we'll do later is create an endpoint in order to add a recipe. So when you come to a form, well, you have to sit back and assess a bit the situation. Because the front-end guy, all he needs is an endpoint to which he posts the information, and that's it. But we all know that it's not that easy. Drupal doesn't, well, it works if you have to post data that would fit into a JSON object. That means that if we want to post something, in our case a recipe to our backend, we'd have to define a name, which is a text field, and also a description, which is basically more text, that can fit in a JSON object. The problem is, or the problems, are the last two fields. You would have a main image, that's the image for the recipe, And in order to prevent the spam on the backend server, you would also, in most cases, add a reCAPTCHA. What that means for our application design? Well, that means that we can't actually use one endpoint that's part of a REST API in order to provide a path for our front application. Because usually, and in theory, you would have to send only the information that the model contains when you make the post request. Well, in our case, we see that we also have to send the reCAPTCHA info. That's not a part of the node, because the node only doesn't care about reCAPTCHA, but we use that in order to prevent the spam. That's why I said earlier when I started the presentation that I don't like to call it creating a REST API for our front application, because it's not actually an API. All the endpoints cannot, in most cases, in real-world projects, cannot be used as part of an API, because you would have things like this. Okay, so I said that there were two problems. One was the reCAPTCHA, which I explained, and the second one is the image. Well, why is that the problem? Usually, the best practice when it comes to passing form data to a backend is by creating a form data object in HTML5 and using that to send info. Well, surprise, surprise, when we create an endpoint in Drupal, our only allowed format is JSON. And JSON is not the same as multi-part form data, which is the content type of the request that we send. So here comes the problem. How can we post our image to the backend server while also sending it in a JSON format? Exactly. You would have to encode the image in base64 and send it as part of the JSON object. Why is that a problem? Well, a semi-problem, because it solves our issue with not being able to post the image. But the object that we get doesn't map exactly on the Drupal model. On top of that, Drupal should be able to provide a REST API for uploading files, because as we know, files are a separate entity, separate from the actual nodes and the others. So in order to make a proper flow, you would have first to send the image, to have a request that posts the image content, and then you would get the ID of the image. You would use that ID in within the rest of the object and send the request to create a recipe. The problem is that there's a bug in Drupal core when it comes to posting images and posting files. So it's not that easy. That's why Drupal still has a bit to learn from this, and has more to develop in order to be able to create an actual REST API. Okay, let's go back to our presentation. We've been through these steps. Actually, there's one thing more I'd like to discuss about the recipe creation. Another part that is important to touch when it comes to creating data on the backend is, can anyone do it? Can an anonymous user just come and fill up this form and send it? Well, some cases yes, in some cases no. When you have to authenticate the user, as my colleague said earlier, there are a few ways of doing that. The first one would be to just restrict the backend server, the backend endpoint, by HTTP authentication. That means that within your request, you would have to add some special headers that in which you pass a token, an authentication token, which will be accepted by the backend, and you will be allowed to make the request. The second one would be to use the Drupal authentication. That means you have to log in the user by using a request to the user/login endpoint with its name and its password, which again is not something that's that safe. Or the proper way to make authentication would be to use auth, which is you would have a backend that deals with the authentication, but in order to authenticate for our application, you won't use credentials specifically for this application, but you will use credentials for that backend. That means that if you are logged in that domain, you would receive a token which you will use in order to authenticate your requests with. Of course, the talk about all of this much more complicated than this. There are special protocols that you need to follow, but that's only not viable. That's only usable when the application grows significantly, because for a small application, there's no need to implement that, usually. Okay. So, in conclusion, we like to read all the Drupal 8 documentation and say that Drupal 8 is ready for a REST API and is ready to implement a backend server. But when it comes to actually doing things, we see that's not correct entirely. There are still few problems when it comes to defining a REST API endpoint, but I can say that it's far easier to do it than in Drupal 7. So we're on a good track. And before I end, I want just to give you a small heads up about something that came up, I think, a month ago or 2 months ago. It's called Reservoir, and it's a distribution made by some guys from Acquia that's specifically targeted on people that want a quick and fast REST API server. So I installed it locally, and I'm just going to go through it quickly so you can see what it's all about. Okay. So it's a distribution, so you just install it easily like any other Drupal site. But you see that the backend interface is a bit modified. You don't have nodes and content types. In this distribution, they're called models. And by default, you get an article model. On top of that, you get a nice representation of the actual content. What we see here is that we have a node that has an image and a body and some tags. And on the right side, you would see its default representation in JSON. That is, this is all the info that you will get if you make a call, a GET request to /node/1 or to our JSON API implementation. You can read about that on the GitHub project. That was linked in the presentation. The format that's used for this is whole JSON. So it's really useful because once you access the information for a node, you would have all the links that you need in order to modify the node or just add more or list more nodes within a single request. What's also cool about this is that you have a special page for observing your API. And let's see if the internet connection allows us. It's still loading, so it might take a bit more. What it does is it has a pretty much complete documentation on all the endpoints that you have for your entities, in this case for our content models. By default, you have endpoints created for file entities, for the article content model, and for taxonomy terms and user entities. But if you just scroll a bit and take a look, this is pretty useful for a headless application, specifically if you are the one that makes the first move in a real project, not the front-end guy. You can just install this, create your models, and give him access so he can see what the structure is and what the actual data looks like. Okay, so that's pretty much it. I hope I didn't bore you that much, and I'm sorry for the fails in the demo. If you have any questions, I would gladly answer, or if you want to discuss anything else, feel free. Thank you.